Some of those who attacked the consulate were inspired in part by televised scenes of protesters storming the American embassy in Cairo in rage over an anti-Muslim video running on the internet.
On September 11, 2015, Jacksonville, Florida honored those lost in Benghazi who stood up instead of standing down. The Benghazi tribute was held to honor 4 American heroes that were murdered and 10 Americans who were wounded in the Battle of Benghazi 3 years earlier on September 11, 2012. The solemn memorial service honoring the United States Ambassador to Libya, Mr. Chris Stevens, U.S. Navy veteran SEAL Tyrone Woods, U.S. Navy veteran SEAL Glenn Doherty, and U.S. Navy veteran Sean Smith, who gave their last full measure on 11 September 2012, included military honors, the colors procession, laying on of wreaths for the 4 heroes, and echo taps. Jacksonville came together to honor those who fought valiantly in Benghazi and to get informed on those in our government who have refused to honor their commitment and who refuse to protect Ambassador Chris Stevens and his security staff. Now you can have the opportunity to hear the real story on Benghazi and its impact on our nation from 4 great Americans who know the truth. The first part is retired Admiral Ace Lyons of the Citizen Commission on Benghazi to tell us the truth of what really happened in Benghazi. The second speaker is the distinguished Michael Del Rosso, who tells us the threat. The third speaker is retired Rear Admiral Charles Cubitt, who shares the consequences of what happened in Benghazi. A special question and answer panel discussion is part 4, where these speakers are joined by the knowledgeable Stephanie Jason. Follow along in each part to learn the whole story, the true story. My name is Ryman Shove, and I am the MC for Jacksonville's 2015.
Our third speaker is retired Rear Admiral Charles Cubitt, from whom we will learn of the consequences. Chuck has over 35 years of worldwide planning, design, engineering, and construction experience in contingency and peacetime environments. In 1985, he was selected as a White House Fellow and served on the staff of President Reagan's Domestic Policy Council. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to retired Rear Admiral Charles Cubitt.
Thank you, Ryman. Everybody just take a deep breath. Close your eyes and kind of try to absorb what were the first parts of this discussion on truth and on threats. Because it's now my job to try to talk about the consequences and then to talk about what we can all do, what action. And again, I especially thank the First Coast Tea Party for putting together forums such as this, which offers us an opportunity to talk about the truth. I think you can see with the way your head feels right now that sometimes the truth hurts. But I would caution that as we go forward, that it's important to stay calm and deliberate. The action that we need must be nonpartisan action, or we'll just wear ourselves out arguing talking points. We've got to talk facts, not spin, and we have to recognize that after we understand the truth, we know the facts, we the people must act. And in Benghazi is like a turning point in all of this. It is a battle in this ongoing war on terrorism that embodies all of the problems that we see around the world, in our country, because when you think about it, we all know the facts about Benghazi, and nothing has been done about it. We know the truth. The truth is being ignored or at best obfuscated. And what do we know? It's not controverted. The ambassador requested more security, and he was ignored. Our U.S. diplomatic facility was attacked. The ambassador and 3 others were killed during a 7+ hour gun battle. Do y'all know what it's like to be in a 7+ hour gun battle? Some of you do. The longest one I was ever in was 4.5 hours. It's a long time. Local response was delayed. Regional response was denied. We know that there was heroic action by those who ran to the sounds of the guns and saved many other lives. We know that the truth was covered up by a bogus video story that was put forth strictly for political purposes. And we know that emails documenting actions during those periods were covered up and destroyed. And finally, I think we can all say that it's a fact that the checks and balances that were built into our government by our founding fathers have failed. And but for organizations such as yours, Judicial Watch, and others, we would be stuck. This would be off the page. Nobody would be talking about it. But yet, organizations digging or saving the day when our government is basically failing. But to understand Benghazi and what it means in its broadest sense, and to understand the current situation that we find ourselves in, not only in Benghazi, but throughout the Middle East and North Africa, you have to ask yourself, why did we bomb Benghazi in the first place? They didn't attack us. They weren't threatening us, but yet we bombed them. I spent a lot of time in Libya prior to the revolution. It was a very peaceful place. It was secure. Women had great opportunities. Business was flourishing. Houses were being built, and oil production was moving from 1.8 million barrels a day to like 3 million. But when terrorist activities began in Libya, and we could go at length as to how that all happened, but fundamentally, prisoners were let out of prison in an attempt to accommodate them and started the fighting. Our country and others went to the UN and said, we need a resolution. There's a revolution going to happen. We need to impose a no-fly zone. So they drafted a resolution for the no-fly zone. Then our country, our ambassador, said, let's add one other part. Let's say that we need to assist with humanitarian assistance. We need to prevent a humanitarian crisis. So it was amended at the resolution at the very end, and the UN passed a no-fly zone with a provision to avoid a humanitarian crisis. But I'll tell you, we went to bomb, and when I heard about the bombing, I was aghast, because it was the first time that I know of that our Navy launched a preemptive attack in direct violation of the laws of war. If you look at the laws of war, a humanitarian or potential humanitarian crisis is not sufficient to justify a preemptive attack. This was actually tested in Kosovo, and they were not able to launch an attack just to prevent a potential crisis. And oh, by the way, we've learned after the fact that a good portion of the Libyan Air Force defected early in the fighting. So there already was a no-fly zone because the rebels were the ones who were controlling the air. When you look at this and you see that we started to bomb anyways, I was in a position because of some business contacts to be contacted immediately about what could be done to stop it. At that point in time, Gaddafi had already been marginalized. People around him were looking to move forward, to be more aligned with the West. And they basically said, Gaddafi is ready to step down. He's ready to abdicate. We really want to find a way to set up a ceasefire and to move to a transition of government. Can you help us? And I said, well, number one, we don't want to talk to any politicians. And number two, we don't want to talk to diplomats. This is a situation that calls for direct battlefield discussions under a flag of truce between opposing military commanders pursuant to the laws of war. The Libyans like that, and I said to arrange this, we need to talk with Africa Command. So I became an intermediary between Africa Command and others who were working with the Libyan military. And we set up a sort of a four-part agreement that there would be a 72-hour truce, during which time Gaddafi's abdication and cessation of all hostilities, the terms of that would be agreed upon. That these discussions would be between General Abu Bakr on the part of the Libyans and General Carter Ham on the part of the U.S. That all hostilities would cease for the 72 hours and troops would withdraw, and that peacekeepers, observers from the African Union would be come in to ensure that the truce was held. There was then an exchange of signs of good faith. Gaddafi was asked to pull back from Benghazi. He did. And then Carter Ham went on TV and basically said, as a part of a routine briefing, you would have missed it if you didn't know the purpose of it, that the U.S. was not going to target Gaddafi. And after that, the next day, the only thing left to decide was where would we meet. I proposed two options. One, ashore at the old Willis Air Force Base in Tripoli, or afloat on a Navy ship, if we could have found one, Admiral, at that point, to hold it at sea or in Tripoli Harbor. In the process of resolving the venue and the time, I then received a call from Africa Command that said all talk was off with the truce. And I said, what do you mean? We're ready to go. Everybody is in agreement. They said it was shut down. And I said, who shut it down? I'll even go to the Pentagon right now and talk to them. I was told it's not the Pentagon. It came from outside the Pentagon. And I said, well, then I've got to go do something. And they said, Admiral, our recommendation to you is just to let it go. Well, I learned later that while I was working on this military to military, much later I learned there was a parallel effort by another group that was working with Saif Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi's son, trying to do the same thing, working with the State Department via the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I learned also that it was shut down in person by our Secretary of State at the same time. So there were two efforts there. Well, from that point forward, we continued to not only bomb, but initially we didn't even have a command structure to organize, the bombing. We had Africa Command doing its thing, the Brits, the French. It was chaos. If you want to understand how chaotic it was, the RAND Corporation just put out a study in July of this year which details all the things that were happening in those first hours of the war until it was ultimately turned over to NATO to coordinate. But the important part of that report, and it jives with things that I was told after the war by Libyan military commanders who were on the rebel side in person, that as the resolution was being debated in the UN, and Gaddafi was moving troops towards Benghazi, the rebels were moving troops from Tobruk towards Benghazi. The rebels had also commandeered 2 gunboats because they had no artillery, they had no armor, that Gaddafi had, and the rebels had 8 MiGs in the air. And so they were going to meet Gaddafi on the outskirts of Benghazi and negotiate the same kind of truce that I was trying to negotiate until the Admiral mentioned Hillary's meeting with Sarkozy in Paris, where they agreed on the terms of the war. Well, we were told that while the UN was debating this resolution, the French attacked Gaddafi's column in advance of the resolution. The document of the RAND put out confirms that they attacked first. It doesn't say when. This infuriated Gaddafi. His troops then moved with a passion towards Benghazi, to which then they said, look, there's going to be a humanitarian crisis that they were causing, and use that as the grounds for the resolution. Again, the whole thing was a narrative that was cooked up right before our eyes, an information operation, the likes of which Michael was talking about. Al Jazeera was reporting it, making things up, and CNN was copying it. At the same time, Chris Stevens was dispatched to be the coordination in Benghazi. And without going into details, what was to be a legitimate arms shipment to, legitimate people that were not terrorists was basically cut short. All the protocols were set aside. The State Department ran it themselves. In doing so, passed arms to Al-Qaeda, including the brigade commander of Ansar al-Sharia, Abu Khattab. To make a long story short, when some of these arms were then sold to Gaddafi so that the fight could continue and take the money to finance more jihad, when General Yunus, who was the commander of the rebel forces, came to confront Jalil with this fax, he was then executed by Qatala's men. Qatala then happens to show up the night of the attack on our diplomatic facility, and possibly with the same weapons, attack our facility and kill our ambassador and 3 others. And then he sat around and drank strawberry frappes while the press talked to him, disappeared for a while. Our special forces grabbed him. He's locked up someplace now with a gag order, even though he was right in the middle of all of this. So let's look at this. The UN set 2 goals: a no-fly zone, prevent a humanitarian crisis. So tell me, why did the bombing stop after a few days once these goals were achieved? I think then you have to look broader and you have to ask yourself, those were the goals put before the UN. What were the US goals in Libya and how did we engage? It seems to look like our goals were regime change and the assassination of Gaddafi. Once again, in key points, right before Gaddafi was killed, when our Secretary of State made a visit to Libya, at the time of the attack on our diplomatic facility, the Gaudi Commission has already reported that those are key periods where all emails were destroyed. Makes you wonder how that happened. We also noticed, and again was back in Libya after the war, in the post-Gaddafi era, and there was diplomatic intransigence. Before the war, the U.S. Embassy was actively engaged, supporting U.S. business, supporting interaction with the Libyan government. Afterwards, they pulled back. Chris Stevens himself, because he was so popular, because he was an outgoing person, I believe that he sincerely thought that because they were his friends, he could become a bridge to facilitate, the establishment of a unified Libyan government, because he was so well liked. At the same time, we know he was very concerned about his security. But I could tell you, notwithstanding the attacks in Benghazi in the April-May time of 2012, I was there in May of 2012 in Benghazi. It was very heavy security, but it was safe. You could stay in a hotel, but you knew that things weren't 100%, right there. You could sense it. But a few months later, the Libyans held elections. 90% of the Libyans turned out and voted. They voted for a sectarian, secular government, and they soundly beat the Muslim Brotherhood. They did not win like they won in Egypt. And then, of course, a few months later in September, our embassy was attacked. Our ambassador was killed. Was this because of the gun running that was going on? Was it because of the blind sheikh? Was it because we had recently droned a guy by the name of al-Libi? This was retaliation for that droning. It still begs the question, why did we have Blue Mountain Security there in the first place? They were not even the main contractor for embassy security. They were given a sole source contract just to protect that group. And they are a cover organization for British intelligence. There were local reports of what happened during this attack. Unfortunately, they are second-hand reports, and they were things that happened even prior to our reaction force being involved in this, that really lead us to believe that there's a lot more to the story, and I'm hoping that a lot of these details are going to come out when the Benghazi Commission issues its report. But Post-Benghazi, one of the consequences was the U.S. Embassy gave no support to U.S. business, and there was no outreach or support to the Libyan security forces. In fact, the last time I talked with Chris Stevens, I said, Mr. Ambassador, use folks like me, who they understand are businessmen now but have a military background, to try to breach the gap here, because the Libyan military is still a little bit wary of dealing with Americans, because for 40 years they could be punished if they were even seen walking by the U.S. Embassy. Let's try to establish some outreach to them. But it didn't happen. So let's look at Libya today as a consequence. Our U.S. Embassy is abandoned. The Libyan government has collapsed and it's split between the duly elected government, which is in Tobruk, near the Egyptian border, and Tripoli, which is basically the Muslim Brotherhood-based government. The wealth of Libya has been stolen. Their economy is in total collapse. Their civil society has broken apart. There are no borders. It's a mass migration of refugees, many of whom have died trying to get to freedom. Oil production is struggling. It's not 1.8 billion barrels, it's barely 200,000. There are continuing bank and legal battles fighting for the remaining Libyan wealth. And the Libyan people have essentially become wards of the state with no money of their own. And so what does our current administration say about this? Remember, they were going in military action, laws of war be damned, and stop this humanitarian crisis. Well, on the 16th of August, just less than a month ago, the State Department put out a statement on behalf of a number of European allies as well. This is about Libya. Without reading the whole statement, they strongly condemn the ongoing barbaric acts by ISIL-affiliated terrorists. That's got to have ISIL shaking in their boots. Strongly condemned. And they were deeply concerned. My goodness. How could you not feel for that? And then they called on all the parties in Libya to aspire to a peaceful and unified nation. They're killing each other, you know. Then they said, oh, there's hope. We welcome yet another round of UN political dialogue. Now, I've had experience with the UN, and particularly in Bosnia. The only thing that the UN accomplished in Bosnia was getting all warring factions to agree that they all hated the UN. And they're in charge of the dialogue here. Then they ended, in ironies of all ironies, by saying there is no military solution and the humanitarian situation is worsening every day. If that's not enough to round the whole bunch of them up, you know, lock them up and ask questions later, I don't know. The whole purpose of this was to use military action to prevent a humanitarian crisis, and now 3 years, 4 years later, they say no military action is possible or solution, and there is a humanitarian situation getting worse every day. Well, you know, I thought about this, and I read a book that talked about a statement made by Demosthenes in ancient Greece when they asked him, how do you stop the decline of Athens? His response was simple. Don't do what you're doing now. Pretty simple. So, as we look at this now, and we ask ourselves, because at this point when I talk, everybody says, Admiral, what would you do? What can we do? Well, it may take a while until we get someone who has the, let's say, the audacity and the swagger to do this. But the number one thing we should do, and we could do it tomorrow, our U.S. Embassy is closed. The embassy staff is sitting in Malta. Reopen the U.S. Embassy in Tobruk, where the duly elected government is. If you have to put a battalion of Marines there, do it. Who are they to tell us that we can't put our embassy anywhere we want to? Number two, established Africa Command forward in Tobruk, put a general officer there, and then planned to return to the shores of Tripoli. Confront the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy in Libya, in the U.S., and everywhere else that they are causing terror and fear. And there's a lot of talk about, should we go into Syria, should we do this, should we do that? Then my most unfavored expression, should we have boots on the ground or not boots on the ground? I'll tell you what we have to do. The policy needs to be confront Islamic fascists forcefully at places and times of our choosing. And there's some other things that we need to do. We need to resolve the theft of Libyan resources and enforce accountability of those who took the money. And then over time, I think we need to facilitate the political discussion within Libya. This is after we've retaken the shores of Tripoli. And talk to them about various forms of government. A fundamental mistake that was made was setting up a parliamentary form of government in the British model when you have so many different sections of the country, so many different tribes. You need to have someplace, just like we have, representatives that are based on the population and senators that are based on the regions, to give them the balance. In time, we could negotiate a mutual defense pact, status of forces agreement. We could then encourage the re-engagement of international business in Libya. And fundamentally, as we're doing this, we would make it absolutely clear to the Islamic fascists that their brand of terror will not be tolerated, and their days of being the schoolyard bully in Africa are over. Now, how do we do this? Well, we know we have the Gaudi Committee. And I know there's some skepticism of where they're going to come at. When I talk to them, they're not sure whether they're going to be able to break through the people who would like them to kind of go away or not. But I'll tell you what, they're committed to try. We have the continued organizations of people like organizations like Judicial Watch, who have found a way to get documents through court action without relying on the corrupt Justice Department. And I think we still have that going for us. And of course we have the 2016 election. But the question is, how can that be different than 14, 12, and 10? Well, I think we can agree, after listening to both Emma Lyons and Michael Del Rosso, that it's our job to hold all branches of government accountable and both parties accountable. There are crimes that need to be exposed and the perpetrators need to be prosecuted. And we have to find a way to assert the voice of we the people. From a Navy perspective, I would simply say this is an operation that requires an all-hands effort. And this is going to be difficult because it has to be from the grassroots, it has to be peaceful, and it has to be nonpartisan. It's entirely possible that although we may have large political divides on the left and the right, there is a common frustration with the establishment of both parties that need to be woken up. So what we thought about here, and you'll be given them at the break before we have the Q&A, is a way to voice your feelings and your dissatisfaction with your leaders in Washington. In 1776, our founding fathers were faced with a situation not unsimilar to ours. And as we reflect today on the tragic attack of Benghazi, the unnecessary war in Libya, and the terrorism which continues to spread throughout the Middle East and Africa, we can't help but ask, why did this happen? Why has no one been held accountable? What can we do to confront the systemic financial and political tyranny that continues to suppress the truth? When faced with such tyranny in 1776, our forefathers recognized it was time to confront and change those who would govern them. It is now time for all Americans to unite and present to our current leaders a reassertion of the Declaration of Independence. At the break, I believe you will be given copies of a document. It's similar in form to the original Declaration, and it discusses the repeated injuries and usurpations of the law which threaten our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In your program is an insert that says that this reassertion is available today, live. It's a long, web address, so be careful when you're typing it, but it's easy to remember. It's just reasserting the Declaration of Independence.com. You'll be able to see a copy of it. You'll be able to sign it. And we're now hoping to get 1 million signatures minimum on this document. In summary, I think what Benghazi shows us, the consequences of it, it's awakened us to the corruption that exists in our government on both sides of the aisle, the inability to even bring people to justice. It's time to do something dramatic, to reassert ourselves, and it's time to band together as we the people and reassert the Declaration of Independence. Thank you all very much.